Hello, and welcome to the Slate Political Gabfest. April 17th, 2025, the Trump versus Harvard edition. I'm David Plotz of CityCast here in Washington, D.C. From New Haven, Connecticut, where she just had a traumatic adventure with her pup, Emily Bazelon of the New York Times Magazine and Yale University Law School. But all is well, right, Emily?
All is well. Thank you to the people and a friend of mine who found my dog this morning when she got confused and lost in our large woody park.
If only we all could have people to help us get back home when we were confused and lost. I'd like to think of you guys in that category.
So true.
Yes. That was John Dickerson, co-anchor of the CBS Evening News and CBS Evening News Plus in New York City. John would have used the platform of CBS Evening News Plus to help find Emily's dog, if necessary. He wouldn't have used the platform of CBS Evening News, though. That would have been too much.
Well, you know, I have to write an essay every day, so I'm constantly looking for subjects, and that could have crossed.
Oh my God! Wait, we'll get to this at some point. But just how desperate have you gotten? Where's the farthest afield you've gone so far?
Mostly, I think it's fair to say I have not gotten that desperate, but I did do one on the inductees into the Video Game Hall of Fame. But
that sounds good.
While that might sound ridiculous, it turned out it turned into like a memory motorway, because the video games that were all from a different part of my life, and then I started to think about like the curatorial. So now I ruined the fun of video games by thinking about it this way. But what you actually are curating when you're collecting these video games like this.
Wait, do the games get inducted or the people get inducted? So it's like Tetris.
It's games.
And Tetris blocks itself up.
Yes. So this is too early, but did you ever remember the Mattel football game? It was about the size of a paperback, and those little cursors that you moved around. My brother brought one of those home, a friend of his at high school, same high school David went to, and he had it for a weekend, and you would imagine that he had brought home like the jewels of wherever, the long lost, like the subject of a Indiana Jones film. Oh my God. Yeah. And that was the beginning of, what is now a huge part of our culture.
Yeah. The first free $20 I had, I bought it wasn't that, but one of those crummy little games. The first time I ever had $20 of my own. This week on the Gabfest, much, much, much more somber. Harvard stands up to Trump. What is going to happen now? Then the Trump administration and the judiciary are headed for a huge showdown over the administration's disregard for judicial orders regarding migrants. What's going to happen there? And then Trump's tariffs and their selective rollbacks have created the perfect conditions for corruption on a massive scale. Are we going to see that corruption? Plus, of course, we'll have cocktail chatter. Decisions made in Washington can affect your portfolio every day. But what policy changes should investors be watching? Washington Wise is an original podcast from Charles Schwab that unpacks the stories making news in Washington right now and how they may affect your finances and portfolio. Listen at schwab.com/WashingtonWise.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Look, I'm a Harvard graduate, and it is extremely rare that I, as a Harvard graduate, have anything nice to say about Harvard. But I do today. I am filled with admiration at what this university is doing and standing up to President Trump's administration. The president of Harvard, Alan Garber, this week declared that the university would not comply with an outrageously onerous set of demands from the national government. Ostensibly to protect students from anti-Semitism, the administration essentially demanded that the university put itself into a receivership where a federal monitor would track hiring and admission and curricula. Neither Harvard nor any other private university can allow itself to be taken over by the federal government, Garber said. Trump immediately responded by freezing $2.2 billion of the $9 billion in federal funding Harvard receives annually, most of that for science and medical research. They're also threatening Harvard's nonprofit status. They also have a bunch of other tools that they may deploy that may be even more threatening to Harvard. So, Emily, Columbia a few weeks ago, faced with a similar set of attacks and restrictions from the Trump administration, capitulated. Why do you think Harvard chose this moment to stand up?
Without defending Columbia too much, I think that it actually was a different kind of list. The list of demands of Columbia were more specific, and some of the things were things Columbia wanted to do anyway. This list of demands about Harvard, as you said, there was just no way the university could have said yes. It was such an overreach, such an intrusion of government power into the university. And, you know, the pretext of anti-Semitism is a total pretext in this way that I'm really finding difficult as an American Jew to watch happen, because I think that this puts American Jews in a really terrible position to be kind of used as an excuse for this kind of government weaponizing of a supposed fight against discrimination. Anyway, so I don't think there was any way Harvard could have said yes. However, losing $2.2 billion in funding is a big blow. Now, you know, Trump is on social media flirting with the idea of taking away Harvard's tax exemption, which would be an even bigger blow with all kinds of ramifications, and using the IRS as a tool of revenge in the way that Nixon tried to do and was smacked down for. And, you know, just really goes to this idea that this president and his folks think they can kind of do whatever they want. You know, listening to Chris Rufo, who's the kind of crusader for this kind of way of dealing with universities, you know, there's this idea that the Trump administration is now wielding civil rights law as a weapon against these schools in the way that the left wielded it against the right. But in fact, if you think about the size of the problem and then the enormous disproportionality of the supposed remedy, it's just not a good analogy. There's something else going on here. And I think Harvard, you know, is standing up for it, and partly just because it doesn't have a choice.
Right. I mean, it is, the disproportionality is a great term because, of course, you know, no doubt there were Jewish students and other students who felt uncomfortable because of protests, and no doubt there are excesses and mistakes and, you know, even forms of discrimination that existed in hiring or in admissions. Of course, that is true. But to existentially threaten these fundamental institutions is part of, I mean, I think we've talked about this before, that Trump is very vigorously going after and attempting to destroy what he perceives as liberal elements of civil society. So the attacks on the law firms, attacks on education, and attacks on media, all are of that same piece. And this is like, I mean, this is like going after the monasteries. This is a very, you know, we're going to destroy another center of power in the United States because we can. And it wouldn't at all surprise me if the Trump administration went so hard as to literally attempt to drive out of business one of these universities. Like, it really wouldn't, if they said, like, we are going to make Harvard cease to exist, which would be stunning. Shocking.
Right. Talk about like a self-own for the United States, right? To take a top educational institution. Education is our number one strength internationally, or certainly one of them. But they're mad, so they don't seem to care.
And just for anybody who thinks that by education, Emily means, you know, the 570th interpretation of the Iliad, while I would make the case that that's important, what's getting targeted here, particularly with respect to the federal funding that's not going to Harvard, is the research that is at the cutting edge of biomedical science, and obviously computer science and the other intellectual property creations that have been economically beneficial, but then also with respect to medicine that have been helpful and are funded because it's the kind of pure research or even targeted research that a government funds to help the entire country. And they do it through Harvard because the smart people are at Harvard and those kinds of institutions. So it's quite useful research that's being paid for here.
And literally, for what purpose? For what purpose? I would urge all Gabfest listeners to read this article that Catherine Rampell wrote in the Washington Post about the economic impact of higher education. So first of all, higher education is literally like one of our greatest exports. So when you think about what is it that we have to run a trade surplus in, higher education is the greatest trade surplus we run, because foreign students come to the United States and they pay a huge amount of money to attend our universities, and they spend money while they're here. And so that's effectively us getting a surplus of their money, and we get to provide them with a good, which is education. That good is also incredibly valuable for the United States, because some percentage of those people who come as students stay, and college graduates who have graduated from American universities who stay here are among the most economically productive citizens or economically productive residents. Too many of them are not citizens, as we're learning. Economically productive residents that this country has. So it's growing this economy. It's making this economy more productive and more innovative. So many doctors, inventors, people in business are foreign born, gone to school here, and then contribute to this society. And it's also this amazing form of soft power. How many people that you have heard about overseas who are helping the United States in some fashion are people who attended American universities and learned about American values and learned about sort of the American system and American freedom from attending those universities, and then are taking that back and improving their own societies, but also being sympathetic to the United States. And so the idea of sabotaging that to make a point about wokeness or to just enhance President Trump's own power is disgusting. And it's like, as you said, Emily, it's a self-own, but that almost is like, that's too small a word. It's an act of arson. It's like an act of arson that affects all of us. And it's infuriating and stupid.
We should, for anybody who didn't actually read the list of demands, I mean, it is like forcing a club for vegans to eat raw hot dogs. I mean, the things that were being asked was that Harvard demonstrate viewpoint diversity, which is, by the way, obviously, I don't know what word one uses, but if on the one hand you are attacking any effort in the federal government or otherwise to rebalance the imbalance in race and gender at every turn, but then are insisting on viewpoint diversity and a regime in which the government approves and monitors the hiring and the admissions and the operation of the school on an ongoing basis. And then also vetting and reporting on international students, the dissolution of all programs that it calls as DEI, as violating federal law, and then also federal control of student discipline and campus governance. I mean, it's basically a thorough and complete either monitoring or even actually meddling in all administration operations.
Yeah, it's like a Big Brother takeover. I mean, I will say, as a principle for Harvard to embrace, having lots of points of view, making sure there's more conservative points of view represented on campus in places like the humanities where they may be super underrepresented, like all great, good, fine. Those are worthy goals, as I'm sure, John, you meant to agree to, or maybe I shouldn't assume that. But,
100%. If you could, not only worthy goals, like necessary goals, but but administered by another form.
Precisely. Like, that doesn't mean that it comes about in this way where the government has this grip on the university and is controlling everything. It's also really interesting to me to see what happens next. Harvard has hired two, prominent Republican whisperer lawyers to represent the school's interests here. And it could both choose to stand up in the form of litigation, which it has not filed yet, but it could, and also negotiate to try to bring about a settlement here. But it's been really interesting in the responses to see that the different factions of the university are really united against the Trump administration here, right? So, people who've been pissed off with Harvard and over its governance, like Steven Pinker, are denouncing the Trump administration. Larry Summers, more sort of progressive known voices too. everyone at the university community level, I think, can feel what a threat this is. And Harvard has a really powerful alumni network, obviously, too. So it's going to be interesting to watch this unfold as those people presumably are galvanized.
On that point about viewpoint diversity and Steven Pinker, who has tried to push for more of it, you would want, if you really believed in viewpoint diversity, you would presumably also believe in good faith efforts to know where it begins and ends. And as Pinker pointed out in the wake of these demands from the government, he said, will the government force the economics department to hire Marxists or the psychology department to hire Jungians, or for that matter, the medical school to hire homeopaths or Native American healers?
So I'm very interested to see where this goes in the actual showdown, because so the Trump administration can squeeze these grants and these contracts with Harvard, and I think they definitely have the ability. That's a flow of money that they can stop, and even if Harvard keeps suing and their things, they can literally make that money stop. So that's one thing. But going after their nonprofit status, I actually think is a fairly far-fetched and unlikely to prevail kind of action.
Illegal.
It's illegal. It's illegal. It is very clear that under any normal reading of the tax code that Harvard is entitled to nonprofit status in the way all universities are and all kinds of other organizations. And also, it's one of these things where to change it, like Harvard doesn't have to pay. Like Harvard just will keep declaring it is in compliance. It will not pay the money. And there's no kind of forcing function. If courts refuse to side with the IRS, which I think courts would refuse to side with the IRS, Harvard will sue, say, like, we qualify, this is illegal, and courts would side with them. There's no way that the IRS can go and get the money, unlike with the federal grants where they can just stop doing it. Even if it's illegal, they can just stop doing it, and it's like good luck Harvard trying to get them to release those funds. Where I think I was talking to a university administrator type last night, and he was saying that he thinks where the next wave of attacks will come is denying Harvard the ability to issue any visas to anybody. So they will not be able to bring in any international students. That's number one.
Yeah, they were already talking about canceling that yesterday.
And number two, to deny any student loans to Harvard students, that they can just choose to not approve any federal student loans, not permit any federal student loans to go to Harvard students. So I bet we'll see that coming next, and it'll be interesting to watch it. Can we also just discuss, it's fine, talk about Harvard, blah, blah, blah. But look, this is not the only university. It's not the university that serves most students. And so it's obviously a high profile assault. What is happening to international students across the country at universities is also really, really disturbing.
Public as well as private. Kids are just getting snatched up, these students. That's what you mean, right?
Yeah. Again, university in Florida, there's now an effort, and I think it's not quite approved, but it's on its way, to empower campus security officers at public universities. So Florida Atlantic University, Florida State University of Florida, to have the ability to stop and demand papers from students. Like to literally stop students and just, force them to present papers and prove that they have the right to be wherever they are, and to then bring them to ICE if the students don't meet whatever standards that Florida has decided they needed to meet. I mean, that is some serious police state craziness. And the dreamers, so there's lots of dreamers in Florida who go to public universities who, have lived in this kind of gray zone status, and they're terrified. They just don't. They can't, how can you go to class if the possibility exists that literally the campus police officer who's supposed to prevent you when, a frat boy gets drunk and throws a bottle at you, like when that person is stopping you on the street to take you and deport you to a country you've never lived in.
I'm really glad you broadened the discussion, because I think politically, one of the tricky aspects of attacking Harvard or Columbia or Penn is you make the fight, the Trump administration shaking its fist at the most elite, wealthy Ivy League institutions. And then one response is like, okay, well, you've got this ginormous endowment. You go ahead and spend it. And in fact, that is a small part of the story, right? It is the focus of this particular assault by the government. But really what we're talking about are these broader issues about higher ed and what it's like to go to school in the United States of America if, you can get picked up at any moment, and whether schools can continue to have the kind of freedom within their own boundaries to set their own rules, make their own policies, educate students the way they choose. I mean, there's like very central values at stake here. And the schools have to figure out a way, more than they've done so far, I think, to join hands, broadly speaking, community colleges, four-year schools, public, private, to have a kind of unified front of telegraphing these principles of higher ed and learning. Like, what do we have universities for?
Our Lily Luciano this week spent time with Mohsen Madawi, who is a Columbia student and a Palestinian activist. And when she was talking to him, he was detained by ICE agents in Vermont on Monday. And same deal, right? So like when you now go to the universities in America on a student visa, and Madawi has had a green card for the last decade.
And that was on CBS, right, John?
Yeah.
So people are being detained because of viewpoints they held and quite, reasonable protests. I don't know the case of Madawi, but I sincerely doubt that he's somebody who planted a bomb at Columbia University.
No evidence.
No,
of that.
right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So, but even people, there were the students who were being picked up for traffic violations, who are being deported because they have they're international students, they have traffic violations, and they're literally being deported for that. And, who's going to come to the United States to be a student under those circumstances? And also the kind of aspects, the pleasure and the terror that the administration is taking is so unsettling. So the footage of the student at Tufts who was snatched off the street by masked officials. Like, who knows who's snatching off the street? They're masked ICE agents. I mean, like, who knows when someone masked comes up to you, doesn't identify themselves, and snatches you? Like, who the fuck knows? Like, it's like that is police state stuff. But also this poor person who's invited in for an interview for his citizenship. He thinks he's going to be advanced to citizenship, and they use that to lure him in to arrest him so they can deport him. And the cruelty of it is so pointless and mean and infuriating. And of course, we will lose all these students who want to come here, these students who have come here, and they will go elsewhere. They'll go to other countries. They'll go to Europe. They'll go to Australia. They'll go to China. They'll
Canada.
Go to Canada. And those countries will invent the medicines. And those countries will have the better doctors. And it's just such a fucking loss. It's such a loss. We're going to be poorer and meaner because of this.
The memo that the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, signed in Madawi's case and others basically makes the case that protests hurt the peace process.
What peace process?
In Gaza, yeah. With just to lay that out there.
But wait, John, there's more than that. The memo says that you can justify someone's removal based on their past beliefs, their current beliefs, or their expected beliefs. It's what we think that you might say based on our assumptions about who you are and what you are, what we think you might believe. That's enough to threaten the fundamental foundation of the United States, and such that you, a green card holder, a person here with on a legitimate student visa, can be expelled from this country, arrested, pulled off the street, and expelled based on what we think your beliefs might be one day. How un-American can something be than that? How much more un-American? I cannot think of it.
By the way, that law that Rubio is drawing on was written after World War II, and what it was actually used for was to try to expel Jews from the country. It's like it has an anti-Semitic origin. I just have to point that out for the irony.
And also, just to let you know that the screenwriters really leaned into this one, is Madawi was arrested when he went to his citizenship to take his citizenship test. The window where he was going to take it had closed, and then suddenly he got a notice that said, "Oh, you can now go in and take your citizenship test." And he obviously knew that this might be a trap, but he went in to take it anyway. And when he went in, there were the DHS agents who were relying on the Secretary of State Marco Rubio's memo to arrest him.
This episode is brought to you by Saks Fifth Avenue. I really need new pajamas or a new nightgown, just some sleepwear that works better for me than the raggedy tank tops and old pajamas that I've been wearing. So I went on the Saks website and found a whole bunch of lovely things in nice light materials, silk, satin, cotton, all kinds of different two-piece sets that I could imagine happily wearing, lovely bathrobes. There's something really pretty from a designer called Natori that looked really nice, and something else from another designer called Eberjay that I'd never heard of. These are the kinds of things that you can easily find if you go online and shop at Saks. So if you're looking for a fun, effortless shopping experience and want to elevate your personal style, head to Saks. That's Saks.com for everyday inspiration.
This episode is brought to you by Planned Parenthood Federation of America. When Planned Parenthood says care no matter what, they mean it. Every day at nearly 600 health centers across the country, clinicians provide reproductive health care to millions of people. As the nation's leading provider of sexual and reproductive health care and the largest provider of sex education, Planned Parenthood Health Centers serve all people, regardless of gender, race, income, sexual orientation, immigration status, or disability. Each year, they see around 2 million patients and offer critical services like birth control, wellness exams, STI testing, cancer screenings, gender-affirming care, and abortion. Despite the political noise, Planned Parenthood is focused on what actually matters: providing care. No judgment, no barriers, just essential health services that millions rely on. This care, whether it's abortion, gender-affirming care, STI testing and treatment, wellness exams, or sex education, it's about letting people live their lives with dignity and agency. And it's the kind of thing worth fighting for. You can help. Donate to Planned Parenthood Federation of America at plannedparenthood.org/defend.
This episode of the Gabfest is sponsored by SelectQuote. It seems every day there's something new to worry about. Well, there's a lot that's out of our control. There's one thing you can control: your family's financial future with life insurance through SelectQuote. SelectQuote has been one of America's leading insurance brokers for more than 2 million families since 1985. And their licensed insurance agents can work to tailor a life insurance policy for your individual needs in as little as 15 minutes. They work with carriers that can get you same-day coverage with no medical exam required. It's important to protect your family and your health, and life insurance can provide that peace of mind. Head to selectquote.com and a licensed insurance agent will call quickly with the right policy for your life and your budget. SelectQuote. They shop, you save. Get the right life insurance for you for less at selectquote.com/Gabfest. Go to selectquote.com/Gabfest today to get started. That's selectquote.com/Gabfest. The Trump administration has been thumbing its nose at judges for months, foot dragging, withholding information judges have asked for, speciously citing national security interests to deny information that judges have a right to see or need to see to make decisions, slagging judges in public, nitpicking. And these conflicts have reached or are reaching the point of crisis, explosion in 2 cases related to immigration. And this, I would say, is where the Trump administration wants to be fighting judges. They're getting the conflicts they want. In 2 related cases, the administration is essentially ignoring or mocking court rulings against them. And it is not at all clear how these cases will resolve. So, Emily, where do we stand on these 2 cases? One involving the poor Salvadoran Kilmar Abrego Garcia, the other involving the contempt of Judge Jeb Boasberg's order about the expulsion of men who are believed or accused of being in Tren de Aragua.
Right. So you have the Venezuelans in the Judge Boasberg's case who are in this prison in El Salvador. And then you have Kilmar Abrego Garcia in the case in Judge Zinis's courtroom. He's also in the same prison, but he's the one who got there by mistake. And you're right. I mean, in both of these cases, district court judges who are used to having a lot of authority and having people do what they say, including the federal government, are getting to the end of their rope of patience because it is pretty clear that the government did not, or is not doing what they say in these cases. And so both of these judges are heading down a path toward potential findings of contempt of court of the government in different ways. Judge Boasberg wrote a 46-page opinion this week in which he said, look, government, I'm giving you a couple weeks to explain to me, to provide me with the evidence for why I should not hold you in contempt for violating my order when I told you to halt these planes that were on their way to El Salvador while we were having a hearing. And there were some interesting facts in this opinion that at least I didn't know, one of which was that after Judge Boasberg ordered his opinion telling the government to turn the planes around or stop them, the planes stopped in Honduras for several hours on their way to El Salvador. And also, a few people were turned around to the United States. There were a few women who the El Salvadorians refused to take into the prison, and also a Nicaraguan man who they didn't want to take because he was from Central America. So those are some interesting details that the government, our government, presumably needs to account for in explaining why it couldn't obey Judge Boasberg's orders in the case of all the other people it then handed over to the prison. Then in the Abrego Garcia case, Judge Zinis had a hearing in which she said, okay, parties, both the plaintiffs who are trying to get Abrego Garcia out and the government defending his custody in El Salvador, you have 2 weeks to answer a lot of questions. We're going to try to get to the bottom of what is the government doing to bring back Abrego Garcia? Because Judge Zinis' orders said to the government, which the Supreme Court affirmed, said the government needs to facilitate returning him. And the government has just been making all these like absurd statements in court about how, and also in this press conference this week with the president of El Salvador, like, oh, facilitate just means that if he shows up at the border, we don't have to turn him away. Well, he can't show up at the border because he's in prison. So anyway, all this like kind of these arguments in court that don't pass the straight face test are now presumably going to be held up to the light of day over the next couple weeks. I think what we can expect to happen is the government is going to stonewall and not answer any questions. And then we're going to have this, crisis about what happens when a district court order or multiple orders go unobeyed. Like, what happens next? What does the Supreme Court do? What does the executive branch do? What does Congress do?
So there was a period where people thought, when Donald Trump asked the Supreme Court to give him broad immunity for anything he does in office, surely a Supreme Court in a country with a constitution that was written and a declaration that was written with a supreme fear of kings would never give him broad sweeping immunity post-presidency. Then they went and did it. What is the version of that in this case?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, let me say that is feeling like the kind of original sin, the setup for this Trump administration, because it seems to be so much feeding into President Trump's instincts that he is like a king, right? So there's that.
Yeah, and it's also sorry to just blunder in here, but I mean, one of the things when you talked about bringing it into the light of day, he has been successful time and again to bring things into the light of day that were seen as well beyond the pale, and then he crosses the line in the light of day and says, see, it actually wasn't a line. And that, in fact, makes it all the more powerful. So the light of day actually has worked really well for him.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you're asking, and I think you are, like, what could the Supreme Court do in these cases that would bend or break the rule of law in an unexpected way? There is a little bit of language in their order in the Abrego Garcia case that kind of tiptoes in that direction, right? So they say, well, there is some zone of executive authority that courts cannot intrude into in figuring out what to do about this particular guy. That sets up the idea of like, oh, well, if the government says, these are our diplomatic relations with El Salvador and there's just no way we can possibly negotiate this person's release, that perhaps the Supreme Court will accept that totally pretextual argument. Now, we know that's a pretext because the contract the government signed, we know, says 300 people for a year for $6 million, and it's up to the United States to decide what happens after that year. Not to mention just all the obvious points about like how much power the United States has versus El Salvador and the performance of having the El Salvadoran president in the White House, like pretending he was being asked to smuggle this guy back in. I mean, it's all just risible, but it's up to the Supreme Court to point all of that out. And one legal principle that some smart law professors were writing about this week that I found really helpful is this idea of the presumption of regularity, that usually in law, the courts presume that the government is acting in good faith, is telling the truth in court, is doing all the normal things that like you do when you're supposed to be the sovereign, responsibly exercising your duties, not to mention you're an officer of the court with the duty of candor from all the rules of legal ethics. And that presumption of regularity greases the wheels for tons of things in court. But the Trump administration is obviously not worthy of it right now in terms of how it's conducting itself. And so if courts pretend to turn a blind eye to that, that's one scary possibility. The other possibility is that courts call their bluff, which is exactly what Boasberg and Zinis are doing this week. And then that also leads us down a path we have not gone down before in terms of how the United States justice system actually operates.
I think in that vein, Emily, one of the interesting things I read was this piece, I guess I feel like it's in the same family, which is saying, okay, we judges will concede that there's a zone of foreign policy activity that we cannot intrude on, that the president has, and that, perhaps even extends to the right to imprison people who without any recourse in a foreign country, and that once they're in that prison in a foreign country, we cannot touch them. That's just in the zone of our own diplomatic relations. What we can do is, before you are allowed to exfiltrate these people from the United States, force you to go through every single possible legal process to justify this. That if you can make your case and succeed, I guess you can imprison people in a gulag. Good luck. Contravenes all that we hold safe and dear, but fine. But we're not going to let you do that with people unless they get every possible legal hearing. Do you think that is a thing that might happen? Is that they just every step is litigated at every level for every one of these people?
I mean, look, I'm not willing to give up on the people that are already in El Salvador.
Seriously.
Because that seems so unjust. However, let's just set that aside for a minute. Yes, sure. If courts feel like they can't trust the government after the process to behave responsibly, then you would want to have more process before someone gets disappeared. I also think it's important, though, to go back to this problem of the people already in El Salvador. Andrew McCarthy, a really conservative commentator for the National Review, he wrote a smart piece this week being like, look, you don't get to say that you no longer have jurisdiction. You no longer control a prisoner by transferring them to a different entity. And he was using the analogy of federal and state court, right? So he was like, look, if you're the federal government and you decide to hold someone in a state prison, you don't get to say like, and I can't bring them back. Oh, my hands are tied. And McCarthy was arguing it's really the same thing for another country, that you can make whatever agreement you want, executive branch. Sure, you want to have a contract with the folks in El Salvador. The courts are not going to prevent you from making that contract, but they are going to question whether that contract interferes with someone's basic constitutional civil rights to due process. And in McCarthy's view, the fact that El Salvador is outside of the U.S. boundaries just doesn't matter for these purposes because the United States clearly still controls the custody of these people.
Also, it's obviously, this is often the case with President Trump, is that if you look at what he does when he wants to do something, he threatens taking over Greenland. Yeah. He talks about creating a Riviera in Gaza. Canada's the 51st state. So for him to suddenly say, "Oh, my hands are tied," is obviously inconsistent with his behavior in office.
John, I know this is trivial because this is human. These are human beings who, deserve to be treated with the dignity that all human beings deserve to be treated with, especially when they have not been afforded the due process that they should be afforded. to turn to the political question. But like, do you sense that this is politically ground the administration is happy to be on? That I know that they absolutely have huge support for their immigration policies. I think people are glad to see action on immigration. But do you think it extends to the theatrical cruelty that they are exhibiting?
Right. So the question you're asking is, when does a kind of gravity in this case kick in? And we've been trying to plot that along the lines here for a bunch of different ways. And one thing that's true with the president's tariff policies, which we'll get to, is that gravity did kick in. The gravity was people in control of the gravity was the bond market. And so gravity kicked in, the president reversed. When does gravity kick in this case? Is there a line between, yes, get these criminals out of the country, and yes, stop this excessive flows at the border? When does that slop over to, wait a minute, disappearing people when you have no evidence, and breaking the windows of the cars of 50-year-old women who didn't do anything other than be here illegally goes beyond? Does that cross a real line, not the kinds of lines I was talking about earlier, where the president benefits from crossing those lines in public? I think clearly the White House believes that they are in great grounds here. Both better to talk about how tough the president is being on immigration than how disastrous things have been on the economy. I mean, remember, he was elected to reduce prices, and what he's doing is not only raising them, but saying my policy is that you just basically have to suck it up when the prices go up because it's for this greater idea, which we'll talk about. But I mean, there are lots of reasons he wants to change the subject, and so the White House believes this. Whether it becomes a political negative is, up to people, but I do feel like the characters here that are not only sympathetic potentially in their own way, but then also disappearing people. If you look at the State Department's human rights report, the last one for El Salvador, which is from 2023, so it's a previous administration. But if you look at what they cite as some of the awful human rights abuses, one of them is grabbing people, taking them away, and not letting their family know where they are, which is what happened in the case of Abrego Garcia. The human rights report also goes on at length about the prisons in El Salvador, most notably Secot, where these people are being held. So I think there is a chance that this breaks out and becomes a politically negative, also because that presumption of regularity, which you mentioned, Emily, that connects to lots of other things as well. And so that it becomes a symbol of a larger problem, not just a problem itself.
This episode of the Gabfest is sponsored by Upwork. Hiring shouldn't be a hassle or drain on your budget. Upwork is your one-stop shop to find, hire, and pay top freelance talent, saving you time and keeping costs in check. Companies at every stage turn to Upwork to get things done and find more flexibility in the way they staff key projects and initiatives. And Upwork's global marketplace is filled with top talent in IT, web dev, AI, design, admin support, marketing, and more. Posting a job on Upwork is easy. With no cost to join, you can register, browse freelancer profiles, get help drafting a job post, or even book a consultation. And from there, you can connect with freelancers and easily hire them. Upwork makes the entire process simpler and more affordable with industry-low fees. Post a job today and hire tomorrow with Upwork. Visit Upwork.com right now and post your job for free. That's Upwork.com to post your job for free and connect with top talent ready to help your business grow. That's UPWORK.com, Upwork.com.
This episode is brought to you by Planned Parenthood Federation of America. When Planned Parenthood says care no matter what, they mean it. Every day at nearly 600 health centers across the country, clinicians provide reproductive health care to millions of people. As the nation's leading provider of sexual and reproductive health care and the largest provider of sex education, Planned Parenthood Health Centers serve all people, regardless of gender, race, income, sexual orientation, immigration status, or disability. Each year, they see around 2 million patients and offer critical services like birth control, wellness exams, STI testing, cancer screenings, gender-affirming care, and abortion. Despite the political noise, Planned Parenthood is focused on what actually matters: providing care. No judgment, no barriers, just essential health services that millions rely on. This care, whether it's abortion, gender-affirming care, STI testing and treatment, wellness exams, or sex education, it's about letting people live their lives with dignity and agency. And it's the kind of thing worth fighting for. You can help. Donate to Planned Parenthood Federation of America at plannedparenthood.org/defend.
Trump's decision to pause some of his reciprocal tariffs for 90 days, then to suspend or pause some tariffs affecting consumer electronics, possibly to do the same for cars. These have been welcomed. These decisions have been welcomed by stock markets. The markets haven't stabilized. They have stopped falling quite so catastrophically. They're just falling kind of in a slow way, like a gentle hill now. We're not going to talk about the tariffs. Well, we will talk about the tariffs, but we're not talking about the tariffs broadly, but we want to talk about a particular aspect of them that's likely to have a long-term effect on the U.S. economy, which is how the capriciousness of them, the instability of them, and the kind of personalized nature of exemptions to them is going to affect the country. So in general, I would just say that one of the strengths of the United States economy has been that it's very fair. Historically, most companies in America have not dealt much with Washington because there have been clear rules. They were applied to everyone in an industry and industries in roughly the same way. Not all the time. There's tons of rent seeking. There's regulations, counter regulations. Industries seek favorable treatment all the time. But mostly, the United States government has not been particularly corrupt. Its rules have been fairly consistent. And this is why capital loves the United States, why it's been the best place to invest for more than a century. There's been fair markets, property is protected, officials are uncorrupt, there's a strong judicial system, and to use Emily's great expression that we'll now use over and over again, although it's a different context, the presumption of regularity. So Trump's tariffs, I think, offer a threat to those fundamentals. He put in these tariffs, he immediately exempted big makers of consumer electronics, which have been very nice to him. John, do you see, as you look across this landscape, both of nations that are seeking to have better tariff treatment, but also industries or individual companies, do you see signs of the kind of swampiness that Trump has always deplored, but which he's so good at?
You've teed up my very first point. I mean, so I already pointed out, obviously, that Trump promised to reduce prices and is taking actions that not only are increase prices, but that basically he admits will increase prices and basically tells people you have to deal with it. But the other thing that is like 180 degrees in the opposite direction from his promises, both in this term and the previous one, is that he was going to drain the swamp. This is, if you were designing a system that would increase swampiness, it's hard to come up with a better one. The number of lobbyists and the number of people who are going to have to spend all of their energy trying to anticipate the whims of the president and then try to meet those whims, which is a system based on odd factors, to say the least, not the market. If you argue that the market operates best when it is allowed to just operate, and there's not a lot of extraneous weird behavior you have to engage in to then allow the market to operate, this creates all kinds of incentives for insider dealing and for sucking up and lobbying. And just one little fact, Tim Carney from AEI notes that there were 921 lobbying clients with lobbyists working on trade during the first Trump term. Then there were 1,400 by 2019 lobbyists working on trade. So you create this entire business that is all designed not at doing actual work, but at massaging this very weird system that is all basically to satisfy these changing whims, which is really far away from any of the economic goods that are being discussed, or economic benefits, I should say, that are being discussed with respect to this trade regime.
It just feels like it's everywhere, isn't it? And that we're almost taking it for granted. So, for example, there's this trial going on this week where Meta is on trial for possible antitrust violations. The FTC's brought these charges, is probably wrong the word, but let's use it, charges about Meta's acquisition of Instagram and WhatsApp and whether that's too much concentration of the market. Okay, so a lot of the commentary is about like Zuckerberg's efforts to suck up to Trump as a way of getting rid of this lawsuit. Not really the legal merits, not so much like, does the FTC have a good case, but like, can Zuckerberg convince Trump to just scrap the whole thing because this is just about the whims of this president, not really about the law at all. And, listening and reading to the commentary, it's not even like people are pointing out how messed up that is. That is not the way it is supposed to work. There are supposed to be some kind of guardrails and boundaries here, right? So that law is separate from the whims of the president. But we are just like way past that.
And it's obviously also totally internally inconsistent with the reasons that this whole trade and tariff adventure was initiated. So if on the one hand, they're, shifting rationales for it, but one of them has been that this is a great national security issue and that electronics need to be produced in the United States because the U.S. can't be dependent on foreign manufacturers when it comes to important components that leave the country vulnerable. But these are many of the things that have now been exempted because of the inside track that that those companies have with the administration. Also, you might add just one other thing. If you think about who's not getting any beneficial treatment, I've spent some time over the last couple of weeks talking to small business owners. They're not getting any breaks. Right. And man, they're just like sometimes like one person who's staked their entire life savings on their business.
And don't have the inputs they need to make the stuff they're making because they come from China.
Right, and they can't make them in the States, and they got no one swinging for them in the fancy meetings.
Right, it's an emergency. It's such an emergency. We need to maintain it for umbrellas. We need to maintain those tariffs on umbrellas. That's an emergency. Oh, but consumer electronics, you guys can get a break. Sure, Tim Cook.
I wonder if a smart lawyer could use that as a way to argue. So this tariff regime is founded on the idea that it's an emergency, and if a smart lawyer could say, let's look at the way this has operated in practice. And in practice, umbrellas are, as you pointed out, David, which I think, some items have massive tariffs, but the things that are actually associated with national security don't have such high tariffs. So the pretext for this whole regime is on its face laughable because of the way it's been actually carried out in practice. Therefore, the authority he used to put the tariffs in place should not be seen as legal.
It's also kind of, isn't it funny the way some of the most successful trade lobbyists, the people with so much expertise, these people who are now so good at, maybe they were an old friend of Donald Trump Jr. I mean, that's another element of the swampiness, which is that it's not enough that there are now these exemptions. It's that the only way to get favorable treatment is to ingratiate yourself with the court and ingratiate yourself with the family, ingratiate yourself with the people who are Trump's servants. And so that also is against principle. You would want, if you're saying, okay, we need to have exemptions, well, those exemptions should be doled out on some kind of principled way because people have met certain criteria and we have made a decision like it is important to exempt this form of steel because of X and Y reasons, not because the person who asked for the exemption has been hired by some random company and that person is a friend of the president. That is also a form of corruption. I've been listening to a lot of podcasts about empires and we had one article in our reading about tributes and tribute economies. And that's a thing I hadn't really thought about. But if you think about what is happening with the United States is that it's going from an economy which operated basically based on sort of more or less fair rules, as we talked about, to one where it's based on tribute. That's clarifying to me. If you think of that, where the Amazon did that document, that series with Melania Trump, where they paid Melania Trump $40 million to license content to do a series about her. That's that is tribute. That the way in which the government of Vietnam is now expediting the approval of Starlink for use in that country to help out Elon Musk, a form of tribute. I wouldn't be surprised if we see literal gifts to the president, or people start putting up statues. If the government of the Czech Republic puts up a big gold statue to Trump in a prominent place, and does that, is that so delightful that it helps them advance their trade case? This is ugly, and it doesn't end well. It doesn't end. It undermines the basic kind of fairness and regular order that has been so important to the United States thriving for so long. And it doesn't all happen in a day, but it will gradually happen.
Right. And they think about the economic inefficiency of all this other ridiculous behavior. That's the brain share that otherwise could go towards productive behavior and productive use of goods and capital. So there's all of that economic inefficiency that is now put into the system to deal with the sort of tribute economy that's being created. And then also that embeds a certain amount of uncertainty as well. What you described earlier, David, was a system that, while it wasn't thoroughly and wholly fair, it was one in which, by and large, businesses could and obviously businesses had to worry about capricious, crazy regulations from different kinds of administrations. So nobody's saying that it was a perfect system before, but just because it wasn't perfect before doesn't mean it should be even less perfect now. But think about all of the uncertainty that now exists for companies as they have to figure out how to operate in a tribute environment. I mean, part of, and the reason that these rationales for the tariff regime are in conflict is, one of the rationales is that you have high tariffs so that companies will come build manufacturing in the United States. Well, first of all, now that they paused the reciprocal tariffs, that rationale seems to have gone away. And when you do these carve-outs, it also lowers the tariffs, which have to be high in order for that manufacturing to take place. But then, just as a business owner, are you really going to come make a huge investment to do production in the United States, if you could even do it, when the rules are so bonkers?
Right. The other thing, just my final point on this, is that it also causes normally ethical people to behave unethically. So it actually is. It's smart for Tim Cook or for Mark Zuckerberg. Well, I wouldn't say of Mark Zuckerberg that he is a normally ethical person. I wouldn't care to pass judgment on there. But I wouldn't say of Tim Cook or any of these companies which are seeking, they're rent seeking, they're going and seeking exemptions. And it makes perfect sense for them to hire Trump-aligned lawyers and lobbyists to offer all kinds of goodies. At an individual level, it makes sense because, their company could face catastrophic consequences if the policies are carried forward, and the Trump administration has shown its willingness to inflict catastrophic consequences on those who cross it. And so they behave poorly, and they do things they wouldn't have otherwise done because it is actually in their shareholder interest in the immediate moment. And that is a bummer. It's a bummer when someone else's bad behavior creates a strong incentive for you to behave badly.
Picking up on that point in terms of the economic inefficiency, Apple airlifted $2 billion worth of iPhones out of India in order to scoot them into the United States before the tariffs kicked in. So there is a whole mess of activity which required a ton of people to fret and figure out how to pull that off, all based on the whimsy of this tariff program. I would add one other point that's in this category about presumption of regularity. The chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, gave a speech on Tuesday in which he said there's so much uncertainty because of the tariffs. The Fed may be in this tricky place where it's dual mandate, which is to keep unemployment low, but also keep inflation low, are in conflict because there's so much uncertainty. And the next day, on Thursday, Trump said Powell's termination cannot come fast enough. Usually people generally believe, including the president's chief economist, that central bankers should be independent, and that has led to the kind of stability you were describing earlier, David. That stability is totally up in the air now as Trump seeks ways to fire Powell and or just call his decisions into question. He's not just saying they're bad decisions, but he's saying they're politically motivated, for which there's obviously no evidence, but which throws more chaos in the system. The question is, what does that gravity-enforcing bond market or stock market, how do they read this? Because this does seem to be the one place where Trump does respond to gravity.
I just feel like over and over again, we have this giant collective action problem, and the way in which the Trump administration is creating the incentives you're both outlining for people individually to take actions that are like terrible for the collective, and then a real struggle to make the collective come together.
Yep. Let us go to cocktail chatter. I don't even have a joke to make. I have no joke to make. Emily, what are you chattering about? Did you find something cheerful to chatter about?
I did. Actually, my husband did. I'm grateful to him because everything in my law world is so dark. There is such a great story in my New York Times this week about how Japan built a 3D printed train station in 6 hours. It's by Kyuko Notoya. And there are these great photos and videos along the way of this like incredibly fast assembly. If you actually look at the picture of the train station, don't imagine, Grand Central Station. Imagine just like a small train station by the side of like a roadside train depot that someone could stand in. But they made it all somewhere else super quickly, reinforced it with concrete, trucked it in, and then they erected it basically overnight without disrupting any of the train service. The printing was done at a factory in one prefecture, and then they brought it over to, it's called Hatsushima Station in Japan. So anyway, check out the story. It's about, the wonders of 3D printing and how quickly it is actually possible to build things contra all the incredible delays and snarls that we often experience in the United States.
Here, we've taken $15 billion and
we'd still be arguing about it.
People would be complaining that there wasn't like an elevator.
The new station, which measures just over 100 square feet, was completed before the first train arrived at 5:45 a.m.
I think the future we're looking forward to is one in which it will be done domestically, but with a dot matrix printer.
That would be that's a very funny concept of the dot matrix, 3D printing.
Cartoons.
Although weirdly, 3D printing is dot matrix, basically. I mean, like that's essentially, it's the same. It's the idea of it, right? It's sort of this assemblage of points. It's like you assemble a lot of points together.
It seems different.
Well, that's true of everything, right? If everything's ones and zeros, those are essentially
fair points. Fair point. Cool. Fair dot matrix, John.
My chatter is about, it's hard for me to think of many things that would be less appealing to me than an African giant pouched rat. However, an African giant pouched rat named Ronan has uncovered 109 landmines and 15 other items of unexploded ordnance since 2021 in Cambodia, which is all the result of the years of war. Exactly. He's a hero. And in fact, he set, the Guinness Book of World Records says that Ronan's set some kind of record in terms of, I don't know whether it's mine detection or pouched rat mine detection, which would be a slightly more narrow category. But the deal, basically, Ronan was trained to do this by a Belgian firm with, using reinforced behavior, which if you all aren't familiar with that, just go on social media for a few days and you will be participating in that kind of, but for much less beneficial uses. And so he was able to do in 20 minutes what it would have taken a human 4 days to do. Obviously, the pouch rat is big enough. It's like the size of a cat in some cases. I don't know Ronan's particular dimensions, but they can grow to be like the size of a house cat, but not so big that they actually set off the ordnance themselves. And essentially, they're trained, and their nose is what smells the chemicals that are in the ordnance. So there you go.
What a nice story. I saw this morning or maybe last night a story about a town in Argentina which kind of now allows capybaras to roam free. Capybaras, if you think of them as giant rats.
I do think of them that way.
But it's so cute. They're so cute. It's these pictures of all these capybaras like wandering around city parks and like taking a nap.
Raccoons and squirrels, all these rodents.
Wait, you put squirrel in the same category as rat?
I don't, because if I think about it that way, I'll start to have like a phobia, and they're everywhere. So that would be a bad idea. But like, yeah.
Huh.
Also possums.
Sure.
Possums are a little bit icky, but I feel possums they're trying. It's not possums' fault. They want to be. They don't want to look the way they do.
Well, they should stop going in the garbage.
And raccoons are terrifying, but they are very cute. And capybaras they really are quite cute.
I feel like there's an actual.
Have you ever seen a squirrel that has lost the fur on its tail? That is a bad look. That is just pure rat.
It's really bad.
It's true. What is it in our aesthetic receptors that makes, say, a chipmunk far more cute than either a rat or a squirrel? Like, what is it that we have become acculturated to that allows us to receive it that way?
Great question.
Alvin
That's something to
and
do
the chipmunks.
with the way the face is constructed and how much it looks like a Disney creature. But I don't know what the specifics are.
Well, I don't think it's how much it looks like a Disney creature. I think Disney creatures are constructed to look like that way because they appeal to us as humans, probably.
Okay. Fair. I reverse engineered that one.
My chatter is about a kind of good TV series that my GF and I are watching, Her Majesty, or Su Majestat, which I keep mispronouncing. It's a Spanish comedy on Amazon Prime, and it's about a Spanish princess, the heiress to the throne of Spain, who, when her father has to go kind of into exile for financial crimes, has to take over ceremonial duties. And she is just a horrible person. She's horrible. She's selfish. She's uninterested in service. She's thin-skinned. She's vindictive. And it's about her attempts to serve as the stand-in queen. It's kind of like, I was thinking about it, it's kind of got like a House of Cards vibe, except imagine instead of a Congress, it's the Spanish crown that it deals with. But it's supposed to be funny. It's supposed to be, I think we're supposed to ultimately come to like her. I assume we are supposed to, by the time the series is over, actually like her. Although I'm maybe 2 episodes from the end and she's utterly unappealing. But is
it funny?
It's pretty funny. It's like, it's pretty funny. And it's also an interesting portrait of it. I think we're so accustomed that we get so much British royal family content that you don't ever think about what are there other models for royal families? Are there other models for queens besides Queen Elizabeth? And she's a really different kind of model. She's a very different, no public mindedness at all. You know, it's and it's an interesting portrait of a different way of looking at royalty. It was fun. Liked it a lot. Listeners, you are chattering. You email them to us at gabfest@slate.com. Thank you. Please keep them coming. Please send us something that is distracting, something that is, inspiring or disturbing or distracting and joyful. Love the distracting and joyful ones. And our listener chatter this week comes from Chicago's Lucy Biederman.
Hi, Gabfest. My chatter is about Henry Hoke's 2023 book, Open Throat, which I read last week. This is a short, propulsive, lyrical page-turner of a novel told from the point of view of a mountain lion living in the Hollywood Hills. Hoke's mountain lion is queer, identifies as a poet, has father issues, is deeply engaged in human affairs, but he is all animal. Despite its whimsical premise, this is not an escapist novel. It takes place in our world, among our creatures, amid our problems and joys and connections. And I think you all would like it a lot. Thanks so much.
That's all for our episode this week, but we also have a bonus episode in your feed. We're going to talk about the Trump's White House's showdown with the Associated Press and also the attack on NPR and Corporation for Public Broadcasting. That is only for Slate Plus members, who also get bonus episodes on other Slate podcasts, discounts to live shows. They don't hit the paywall on the Slate site. So If you are a member, thanks so much. Please enjoy our bonus episode. If you're not a member, subscribe to Slate Plus directly from the Political Gabfest show page on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or visit slate.com/Gabfest Plus to get access wherever you listen. Also, there are lots of great new Slate podcasts this week, and I'm really excited to listen to the Student Loan Paradox, which is a Money Talks episode. It's about the federal student loan program. It was meant to help students seeking a route to a better life, but it is putting so many of them into crippling debt instead. Journalist Jillian Berman, who's the author of Sunk Cost, a book about the nation's broken student loan system, joins Emily Peck to unpack the history of the national student debt system and discuss where it stands now. And it's obviously a very fraught moment because it is clear that the Trump administration is going to use those federal student loans as a tool to get things that it wants. That's our show for today. Our researchers, Emily Ditto. Our theme music is by They Might Be Giants. Ben Richmond is Senior Director for Podcast Operations. For Emily Bazelon and John Dickerson, I'm David Plotz. Thanks for listening. We will talk to you next week.